Welcome to the Next Pivot Point podcast. This season, I am focused on sharing stories and ideas from global experts on diversity and inclusion. My purpose is to share diverse stories so that you can learn from others' lived experiences and walk away with actionable strategies to lead even more inclusively. I share this information because inclusive leadership is a journey. It requires bravery and courage, and you do not have to do it alone. At Next Pivot Point, I believe we are stronger together as allies. Let's meet this week's guest. Welcome to this week's episode of the Next Pivot Point podcast. I am joined with another amazing diversity and inclusion expert, Sabreet Kang Rajeev, and she is a first-generation Indian American of Sikh descent. Sabreet is a full-time social science researcher and part-time writer. Throughout her life, Sabreet experienced the beauty and struggle of being a part of the blue-collar immigrant family, and she's driven to raise awareness and empathy for a minority group of Indian Americans who do not historically come from economic or educational privilege. Her book, Generation Zero, is her first book, so we'll dig into that and more. Welcome to the show, Sabreet.
Thank you for having me. I'm super excited.
Same here. Well, I know you have a really interesting lens of being first generation Indian American and writing and researching about the issues that are really pertinent to that first generation experience. So I can't wait to learn more about that. But before we dig into your book and more, tell our listeners, how did you decide to study this and write about this?
I feel like there's no one straight answer on how I landed on this. It's been like a multitude of choices that I've made, but it's really the best way that I like to talk about this is like I've always loved listening to people, love researching their thoughts, qualitative research, quantitative research. I've just been really passionate about that. The more I gravitated towards that, I just learned it really depends on how you take your own personal perspective and your own cultural background on the lens of being a researcher. So the way I think about it is like, when you go to the doctor's office or the eye doctor's office and they put you in behind that thing and there's like A or B. Is this lens working or is that lens working? And I feel like through my education, through my work experience, having all those lenses being put on in front of me helped me really focus on like my true passion of what I want to do.
Yeah, all those different lenses. And yeah, it's rarely, one or two. There's usually like a lot of overlap in those. And diversity work, especially, can be very ambiguous and a dual reality, that paradox that sometimes exists. So, I'm excited to dig into this. Well, tell us about your book, Generation Zero. I'm curious, what's it about and what do people learn from reading it?
So Generation Zero is really a story about a South Asian immigrant experience that's not known in the mainstream society. So right now in the South Asian world, the immigration narrative that's known is that, everyone comes over here for professional degrees, they're either doctors or lawyers, like the mild minority myth that's upholded in the South Asian community as well as American society is what is really well known. But what it does is it eradicates and silences people that don't have those historic, if that's not how they have immigrated over here. For example, if you're a blue collar worker, if you are working in a restaurant, if you have, came to America illegally to pursue a dream, just to work as hard as you can, those narratives are not well known. And I've always been really fascinated about this is that, having awareness about any issue is great. Like knowing that Indian Americans, South Asian Americans exist is like really cool. But, you have to take it a step further, think about like all the subcategories of the subcultures in that and their experiences, how they might be different. And the book really is about that. It's about my mother and father coming to America in different ways, not traditionally, and then having me here and my experiences of like growing up American, growing up also as a South Asian, and understanding what that means to be an American here, going to school, learning about my identity, my hyphenated identity, and then what that actually ends up becoming like for a person that is kind of struggling between two realities of, am I either Indian, am I either American, and what does that mean for like the professions that I choose? How do I go about explaining to people like I'm actually this type of person, and maybe I might need some help um, studying about this topic because I'm not the historical, like I have all of my stuff together. Maybe I need more help with, speech or language or something like that. It's been kind of challenging understanding that.
Mm-hmm.
So that's what the book is
Yeah.
about, just talking about those things that
I
not
love
all.
that. There's dual experiences of what it's like to be Indian and American. And, I really like undoing these stereotypes that we all hold. I think a lot of times in affluent communities, when you do have immigrants or first generation folks that are brown, we tend to say, they're to your point, very focused on education. They came here to get their degrees. They're here with a big company because they're a rising global leader. Whatever the assumptions are, it's of that association. That's not always true. Like that's not reflective of everyone's experiences, and it's not fair for that to be the standard of which we apply, and the lens of which the majority group can often get it wrong. That story. So I'm curious, Sabreet, on what you said about subcultures. Tell us more about that, because another challenge I think we have, especially as Americans, we tend to think, South Asian immigration, it really falls into two camps, usually Chinese or Indian. And then we don't understand, like, those are huge, massive countries, right? With huge populations and lots of subcultures. So tell us more about subcultures and how we can learn more about them.
I feel like this is my favorite topic because subcultures is so fascinating to me. It's like thinking about from like a sociology perspective, thinking about one culture, you can think about the macro level, so Indian, and then the micro is like understanding all the different states, the cultures around that, the influence religion might have, the region you live in, your family's background. I mean, it's endless. If you're, you know, how you identify yourself as a male or female. I mean, it's truly endless. And when we think about just like if I would just take it one step like back, is like South Asian. There's so many different other countries that are, involved in the South Asian experience, but unfortunately, either Indian or Chinese is like the dominant one. And even that, silences a lot of other people that might be from Pakistan, Bangladesh, and stuff like that. So I always try to use words that are encompassing of everyone's experience. But even in the Indian experience, I think it's really important to talk about, Indian people in our country in India is very stratified. The North and the South do not talk to each other. There might be like a common language, Hindi, but everyone speaks different languages in every single state that they're in.
I didn't know that. That's so interesting.
It's truly remarkable, actually. The difference that I've noticed is that in America, we all speak English to each other.
And we
So
can go
it's
to like Texas or the coasts and be able to communicate and understand each other.
correct. And then it's just like, that's like, for example, for if I live in Maryland and now I want to go to Delaware and I have to learn the language of Delaware, I'm freaked out. Like, I don't know
That would be
what I
so
should do.
strange.
It'd be so strange, but there's such rich culture in India that is what it's like. And even though like in India the language that's supposed to unite everybody is Hindi, that doesn't necessarily mean that people speak it. It's kind of like the language that's really dominant is English. Are you surprised? Globalization makes sense totally. So it's like they don't really talk about that. But the bigger thing that I want to say is that even in those different states, the way that they practice certain things, the way that they either are, what careers they pursue and stuff like that, really depends on the geographical location of where their family has come from. Personally, for me, the Indian narrative that's known around here is like people that come here have educational degrees, and if you really trace back their surname, where they come from in India, they might be coming from white collar states. There might be cities. It might be where agriculture isn't big. But if you look at my history, I actually my family comes from a state called Punjab, which is like a state of farmers. And for as long as I can remember, farming has been the agricultural industry of what that state is doing. They provide all the food for Indian around the world. And education isn't really seen as something that as important when you have all these fields to attend. So it's kind of like that is our dominant experience. And when you immigrate over here and you're trying to get educated and maybe you are struggling with English or anything like that, your experiences around your identity are challenging, because then you start to realize that even in your Indian identity, there's so many layers of stratification that you don't even meet up to that really idealistic world in America about what it means to be an Indian, if that makes sense.
Yeah. I mean, all the different variations. And like you said, I mean, I don't think, in just thinking about Indian Americans that I've spent time with, I don't think a lot of them I've spent time with come from an agricultural background, like you shared. So that has to be, I imagine that's a unique experience or a point of awareness, to your point about telling different types of stories. So we're not all like one way, right? We have all these different dimensions of difference. And it's not as simple as just kind of putting people in this affluent Asian bucket that we like to. That certainly is reinforced in our media. And I can think of countless things that lead us down that stereotype, but really checking that stereotype. And like all diversity conversations, we want to get to know people as full humans, right? We don't want to place labels on them. So I'm curious, growing up in America, and having a different cultural lens, I'm curious what that experience was like. If you could give us a window into your world and what it was like to grow up as an Indian American.
I love analogies. So the best analogy that I have to explain that experience is like, and you're in a house. So my house is, I'm in America. Every different door in my house, it was like a different experience for me. And the way that I like to talk about the Indian American experience is that when I would open the American door, there's a couple of things that stratified me. Social economic status, the color of my skin, that I'm a woman, and what my parents do for a living. My parents work labor jobs. So all these things, like, the community that I'm connecting with in the American culture is very different. So then sometimes when I would go to school, really, I learned a lot of things in school in my community and had to interact with a lot of different people, is they would ask me questions around just general questions. I'm not trying to pry, but where are you from? What do your parents do? And it's my emotional reaction of how I would answer those questions that made me understand my identity more. So if someone would ask me, what do your parents do? I would freak out. I would be like, well, they own businesses, because I know what the Indian stereotype is. And they're like, oh, that's cool. Like, what type of business? Like, do I tell them that my dad has a taxi, or do I tell them that he works for himself? So it's like living in that reality of like, what is the best face I can actually show my American experience, because I don't feel welcome. And whenever I would feel uncomfortable, I would slam that door. I would try to open the Indian door. And even in the Indian door, in the Indian community that's in America, depending on where you live, the states that you are, so many different things. The people that you interact are different types of Indians, South Asians. The list is endless. And those questions would still be there. Like, where are you from? Hey, I'm from India. And what do your parents do? Oh, we're from a state called Punjab. Oh, we've never met anybody from Punjab. What does that mean? And then you would also feel less than in the Indian identity, because I wasn't the majority voice. Like, even though every voice is welcome in both doors, the more questions people had, the more inquisitive they had. It just, as a growing human being, trying to understand both of my respective identities, the questions hurt my own realization of who I authentically was. So I would just resort back to closing both doors and like understanding that I don't belong in any of these doors. And it wasn't until later on in my life that I created my own door. I'm like, maybe I'll just remove this door completely. I'm going to remodel my house. Like, these two different identities are not working out for me. And, I picked and choose parts of my Indian and American identities that really resonate with me as a person. And what I really like to think about is like every question, every just curiosity, anything that someone wanted to learn about. Not only did it make me uncomfortable. If you think about not being a majority voice, you kind of always want to put your best face forward because you want people to welcome your voice, to understand, it's really hard to be respected when you're a woman, person of color, um, you know, lower lower socioeconomic status, to have that respect, to actually get that respect and actually uphold it are two different things. So it's kind of like always juggling between identities and figuring out how can I get them to respect me, because everyone's voice, regardless of whatever they have, should be valued.
Yeah. Yeah. What you're saying just rings so true for me is I'm really passionate about talking with young people about how to talk about diversity so we don't have to learn how to talk about this later in life. Seems obvious, but very few tools I've come to have this conversation with my daughter. And she has a dear friend right now that is Indian. She's been to her house, for a birthday party. Well, before pre-pandemic, she'd been to her house. But we talk a lot about her because Jane, my daughter, wants to understand Sornima, but she doesn't want to ask questions that are like that, right? Of labeling you and making you feel like you're the other. So we've really worked on this of like, what might be some good questions to show you're curious about her culture, but you're not labeling her as different than you or less than you, or putting her in this unique identity that's opposite or somehow non-congruent with who you are. I'm curious, like, what would you recommend? What are some questions? What are just like conversations that, if you are curious about somebody from a different culture, how could you ask in a way that's not offensive, that doesn't make them feel like the other?
The way that for me, I think I love that you're doing that. First of all, I just want to say that's really amazing. It's like the way that you approach those questions and the way that you approach those questions in your heart. It's the delivery of them. And when you approach someone with love, empathy, and genuine understanding, or understanding of who they are as a person, I think it comes off differently. Like, I'll give you an example. If your daughter's going over to an Indian American's house and they're celebrating something, or there's a picture of a god or a deity on the wall, there's one thing that she could do is saying, "Hey, I recognize that. Could you talk to me more about that?
Yeah, that's
I would
good.
love to learn about what part of India, or is that something that everyone does? Like, I would just love to learn like the differences between the gods and what you guys practice." And even like I love doing this whenever I approach any kind of culture, whether it's a dominant or a minority culture. I ask them questions about what they feel comfortable showing me. So if they're celebrating like a festival like Diwali, I ask them, why do you celebrate it? I would love to learn more, because believe it or not, Diwali is celebrated different ways in all of India.
I bet. I that's something I've just dug into, is understanding Diwali better and what it's a celebration, right? It's kind of like a festival almost. It's not a holiday. Am I getting that right?
Yeah. So, yep, you are.
That's really
And
neat. And there's cultural differences. Like you said, not everyone celebrates it the same way. You probably have different rituals, different traditions, just like, Americans do with Christmas or other holidays. Not everyone celebrates it the same. But I loved
exactly.
leaning in. I'm hearing you say, just with curiosity, like, I noticed this. I think that's a really good way to say, I notice a difference, right? I see differences, but I'm not going to assume things about you based on those differences. And I'm not going to tell you it's weird or point out that it's different. I'm just going to say, hey, I noticed, like you said, that painting, this tradition, your religion, whatever it may be. And I'd like to know more about that. Would you be willing to share more about that? And I think as young kids, if we taught our kids how to have that conversation again, so that you wouldn't have had to have these weird experiences growing up, always probably having to filter and kind of show different dimensions of yourself depending on how psychologically safe you probably felt at the time. So much of it just comes back to ignorance. I think so many people just don't have exposure. They don't know how to ask these questions, and leaning on curiosity as an ally muscle, I think is always helpful.
Yeah, definitely. And if you think about just human beings in general, regardless of if, you know, they're younger or older, it doesn't matter. Anything that's different kind of scares us. So when we try to learn about those differences, unfortunately, a lot of people's like natural reaction is to go into like fight or flight mode. Like, why is that different? Why do you have that weird stuff on your hands? What? I've never met someone like this. Like, trying to make sense of their identity and the reality and of their culture, and you're just seeing them as they might have that and I have less, or I don't understand those things. But if you just peel apart everything, regardless of wherever you are in the workplace, home life, whatever, if you just approach it in a way of like love, like, hey, I would love to learn more because I have no idea what that is. People can genuinely see that, and the types of responses you would get, the knowledge that you would receive is vastly different than coming from a place of, that's peculiar, if you know what I mean.
Oh, yeah. Coming from a place of judgment, right? But to your point, as humans, we naturally kind of look to people that are similar to us. We all have this affinity bias to kind of surround ourselves with similar types of people that we quote unquote can trust. And when we see differences, yeah, it kind of does trigger us. There's kind of this fight or flight mode that it triggers in our brain, and it elicits these unconscious biases that we're sometimes not even aware of. And so fighting some of that and resisting that pattern of thinking and looking at difference as a positive thing. One thing I remind myself of conversations just like the one we're having right now is I get to learn something. You and I always ask my guests, like, what are the things you like to talk about, right? I like to talk about allyship. I like obviously talk about diversity, but it's more important. I'm going to learn a lot more by knowing more about the other person and what they want to talk about, and giving them that platform, that stage to talk about it. I'm going to walk away from that conversation being a better person, being a better ally, having new content, new information. Whereas if I just talked about what I wanted to talk about, right, and similarities, I would walk away not knowing and learning anything new, which how fun is that?
What was the point of talking to somebody? You just talk
Right.
to yourself.
But how many conversations do we have about stuff we already think, already know, already do? We
So
don't
many.
go into it with like that growth mindset that's really needed. I think that's what I'm really picking up from this conversation. Sabreet, I'm curious too, like going along with this like window into your world as being first generation and having written about this and researched about this. What are some other like tips, or like I think people are always kind of looking for like, what are the things I can do to signal that I want to know more? I want to be an ally for people like that are different than me. What would you recommend to people, especially right now when it's such a polarizing climate around something like diversity?
Oh my goodness. Like, I think the first thing I would recommend is just, thinking about your own identity and your own, biases that you might have, regardless of where you work and stuff like that. Just being mindful about them can be so helpful to understand other people's like experiences. Like, for example, I'm bilingual. I know like 3 languages, I believe, and I'm speaking with you in English, and just thinking about the English language, right? The way that I might pronounce a few things, the way that I might structure my sentences might be different because of the way that I've learned English here. Even though I'm an American, I've learned it since I was like, 1 year old. It'll be different because I know so many different languages. And sometimes if you think about in the work setting, or if you're just conversating with anybody, maybe the way that I'm talking, the grammatical structure of my sentence might be different. You can approach it in 2 different ways. You can either say, this woman has no idea what she's talking about. Or you can say, wow, I wonder how many languages she knows. And I wonder how they grammatically structure these other sentences in whether it's Hindi, Punjabi, any language. And how amazing is it that she's able to shuffle and talk through these different things instead of saying, that's not how I speak English. So maybe you should learn how to speak the English that I speak. Do you see what I'm saying?
Oh,
It's
there's
like,
such a difference in how that's said, right? It's judgment, it's labels, it's you're less than, you're different than me, and you must conform to my version of normalcy.
and it's like so interesting to me because I think like especially in this time, it's like, what are let's just think about it from a different lens. It's so polarizing, it's very scary. But let's think about it as a great opportunity to learn about each other, about all of the
Hmm.
ins and outs of each other, thinking about, really an Indian American and how many different kinds of Indian Americans are there if you're really passionate about learning one subculture, or thinking about, even a profession like researchers, right? There can be so many different types of researcher. We have scientific researchers, we have qualitative researchers, social science researchers. I mean, it's endless. There's a big umbrella. Like, what parts of that chosen profession identity do you want to learn more about? And how can you educate yourself around that? Can really help you understand the climate that you live in, what values that you like to learn more about. But more importantly, it can help you accept a lot of people around you, even if you don't see them down the street every single day, because we're all different.
Yep. Yeah, we're all different. And there's so much of our human experience that's similar. But there's so much of it that's different. And that's how we learn. That's how we grow, by recognizing those differences and embracing them for positive change. This has been so good, Sabreet. I'm curious, for our listeners that want more of a window into the world of kind of this first generation experience, how can our listeners stay in touch with you, get their hands on your book, all that good stuff?
So you can get in touch with me by going to sabreetkangrajeev.com. If you want to read my book, it's on Amazon, Barnes & Nobles. You can just look up Generation Zero, but just swing by my website. Even if you just want to say hi, send me an email. I love listening to people. So just come through and we can talk through about the immigrant experience, being first generation, second generation, just your human experience, because that truly is beautiful.
Yeah. Oh, it is a beautiful story. And your window into the world today has just been so helpful and so engaging. So I appreciate your fresh perspective, and we will link to that website in our show notes and where to get the book, Zero Generation. Definitely a great tool to help people on their journey to being an ally. So thanks, Sabreet, for sharing your voice with us today.
Thank you so much for having me.
I appreciate you listening to this episode. If you like this podcast, the best way you can be an ally is to write a review on iTunes, on Spotify, on Google, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. Every review helps other allies find us. I host this podcast because I believe we are stronger together as allies.